Hello, everyone, and welcome to the stream. Thank you all for being here. Hello, Sergey. Hello, Gaute. Hello, Otto. Hello, Alex. A lot of familiar names there. Thank you all very much for taking the time out to be here today. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we gather, and pay my respect to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people today. Yes, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. This is our second last stream for the year. Where has the year gone? I can't believe it. Want to put out a huge thanks to Leigh. Leigh has actually been in two of our streams in this back half of the year. He has been an absolute trooper. And the presentation he's going to be doing today is kind of an extended version of one that he did recently at GCAP. So if you were watching some of the GCAP streams, you might have seen when himself and Ali did the stream together, or maybe you weren't able to actually get to see their stream, in which case you'll be able to see Leigh's part of it now. So as always, we're going to have the presentation from Leigh. Then afterwards, we'll have about sort of 15 minutes for a Q&A session. Then after the Q&A session, we're going to head over to the Games with Wings Discord, and we can continue the conversation over there. So without further ado, Alex, it's just, honestly, this year has just flown by. I can't believe we're almost in November already. But before we do reach November, I should probably hand you all over to Leigh, who is going to get on with his presentation. So Leigh, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. If you can't see or hear me, just start screaming over me. Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming along to check out my talk. Paul kind of gave the backstory for it. So this was a talk that I gave at GCAP about 4 weeks ago now. So this is the two-way street, and it's about communication skill in game design. I will just jump straight in. Please, if you've got any questions, chuck them in the chat, and Paul will save them all up until the end and bombard me with them. So I want to start by talking about Heraclitus. For anyone who's unfamiliar, Heraclitus was an ancient Greek philosopher in what is now modern-day Turkey, and which modern historians have decided counts as part of ancient Greece, because why not? And one of the things that he was trying to convince people of was the idea that everything is always in a state of change, or what philosophers would typically refer to as a state of becoming. Everything's moving and everything is always changing from one thing into another, and that's just part of the nature of being. This was not a particularly easy concept for Heraclitus to convince people of. It was rather difficult and abstract, so what he ended up doing was illustrating by example. And he said that you can't step into the same river twice. What he meant by that is that in between the time it takes you to step out of the river and back into it again, all of the particles and molecules of water that were flowing past and touching your ankles before are going to be a totally different set. And he used this as a way to illustrate what he meant by his philosophy of flux. So he wasn't just applying this to water or rivers or anything like that. He was saying that even something like a rock on a molecular level, there are always things that are moving and changing. So that's my cold open. Who is this talk for? I started by thinking this was a talk for designers because I am a designer. And then I thought, actually, this one kind of also works for artists. And then I realized producers or engineers could probably also get something out of it. And then I broadened it to game developers. And eventually I just landed on, look, if anybody who communicates abstract or non-existent things to other people as part of their daily lives, as part of their work, should get something out of it. And who exactly am I to be giving such a talk? My name's Leigh Harris. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an associate lead game designer at Wargaming Sydney, have been for the last 3 years or so. Prior to that, I was an indie game dev, and along with my sister Elissa, I ran Flat Earth Games. We released several games over the course of a decade or so. For a little while there, I was a teacher for 2.5 years at the Academy of Interactive Entertainment, teaching game design. For about 6 odd years, I was a games journalist, working at various publications and mastheads, most notably being the founding editor of MCV Pacific. And the way I got my start in this industry was in PR for Rockstar Games, where I was for 9 years. And I wasn't going to go too much into my background with the talk, but it kind of seems relevant, as I think that like one of the things that got me to write a talk like this was that a lot of my previous experience kind of all has one thing in common, which is communication. So obviously, when I'm talking about PR, I'm talking about gathering, getting latest and greatest game from Rockstar and trying to represent it in a positive light to journalists who are coming in to check it out, and trying to make sure that those journalists understand what the creative vision for this thing is and what people are trying to do. And so the nuances of exactly how you word something like that were they were specific and specific for a reason. There was a lot of sort of honing that went into that. And as a games journalist, it was a similar kind of thing, but from a different perspective. Like you go into an event or a room to check out a game, or you have an interview with somebody, and you need to take that experience that you've had and convey it to somebody who's one of your readers, hopefully in a way that's going to make them go, oh, cool, I get what this thing is about now. So you're a degree of separation away. So you're trying to make sure that the experience you had enters the mind of your reader as well as possible, or as accurately as possible. And then in teaching at AIE, that was again something really similar. Like you've got a class of 20 or 30 students in front of you, and you've got to try and make sure that you're communicating some kind of new concept people might not have heard of before about game design. And you need to make sure that they've all learned it correctly. You need to make sure that everyone in the room now understands how and when it's a good idea to use RNG, what a system is and how it's different than a mechanic. And these like small nuances are important because everything I was teaching was stuff that didn't really exist. It was phenomena and concepts that we'd given names to, but which you couldn't easily point at and go, this is what I mean. And then when we get to my career in game dev, it's a different thing again. Each game needs to teach something to the player. Every new game you pick up is going to have its own set of rules, and they are sometimes based in reality and sometimes absolutely not. And you need to try and explain to a brand new player, hey, this is how I work. These are what my rules are. But the rules themselves are hidden and abstracted from the player's view. So your skill in doing that kind of applies. And it's just something that I noticed over a long period of time that was a commonality in every single job change that I had. And I wanted to talk about it now because I feel it's very important, and because I've noticed a lot of people are not particularly good at it. So I'm going to go through what I mean, and then at the end, you can tell me if this was so simple it could have been a tweet, or if you are very engaged by it. And I want to start by a game called Majestic Knights. This was a game, I was doing a studio PR and marketing for this. This came from a Sydney studio called Epiphany Games. This would have been about 2013, 2014. And it was an isometric perspective game where it was set in the 1960s, and every single conspiracy theory that you'd ever heard of was true. And so you're a secret agent and you're going around to all these seedy places dealing with shady characters like the one we've got on screen here. And you're talking to each of them, trying to figure out the truth of what's going on. And you moved around, there was action sequences and all that sort of thing. And the developers were talking about this game as like an action RPG. And we started going with that. We did some demos of it and that sort of thing. And what we started hearing from players was they were going, hold on a second, in what way is this an RPG? And I was like, well, wait, what do you mean? Is that not right? And we just found that people were frustrated for some reason that I couldn't quite put my finger on. So I reached out to a few different people. I tried Googling, but it's not that helpful looking for a definition of RPG. I think most of the people who are concerned with the definition of RPG are trying to define the difference between like a Dungeons and Dragons game and a modern video game, which was not what I was trying to get at. So I ended up just putting it to my social media feeds and doing a poll. And what came back was that what I asked people was, what is the most important or the most prominent sets of features that you expect from a game if it's an RPG? And some people said they wanted branching dialogue, non-linear environments, open worlds, all of which this game had. But one that every single person seemed to agree on was, and I think it might have been in IGDA Sydney where I was asking this question, so thank you if you answered it back in the day. But everybody agreed that it required that you be able to upgrade your character and assign stats to different traits so that you could customize them. And that was something our game didn't feature, and it was clearly going to cause problems for us. So we ended up stopping referring to it as an RPG. We instead refer to it as like an action adventure game. And adventure is one of those delightfully nebulous terms that probably also doesn't mean a great deal, but I think we massively dodged a bullet by not referring to it as an RPG because we didn't end up with people picking up the game and going, this is not what I expected, voting you down on Steam, and then, the rest would be history. So, if you'll excuse the second person here, I'm presuming for a moment that you're a game designer. And if you're not, that's fine. This should still all be relatively understandable. If you're a game designer, you're creating something which didn't exist until you created it. You're creating a non-existent thing. And that's going to be tricky. You're going to have to somehow birth this thing and make it into a real thing. You're also trying to articulate abstract concepts to people. You're trying to inform them about how your game works and what the rules are if they're a player. Or if you're like me, you're talking to other devs and saying, this is how I would like this thing to be. And other people are doing some of the building. So in my case, I've got a lot of engineers and artists who they need to understand exactly what it is that I'm trying to get out of them for a particular feeling or a particular mechanic. And that's tricky. It's a little bit difficult to try and describe something to someone and then have them go, you mean like this, and build it exactly in the way that you're thinking. Some designers do this by making prototypes that kind of do what they're after and then say, here, make it like this, only better, please. And that's not every designer. That's certainly not me. It's not my area of expertise, but it's something that without that, you'll still need to have really strong communication skills to get people on board with what you're doing. And the other thing that you're doing is kind of the reverse. You're interpreting a lot of feelings from people. You've got all of this feedback coming at you at all times. You've got players, you've got stakeholders, you've got developers internally, you've got friends and family, beta testers. Everyone's giving you all of their thoughts about your game. And it's really, really tricky to just read through reams and reams of feedback and people trying to describe what they like or don't like and make sure that you're accurately getting an understanding of what it is they're trying to say. And one of the main points I want to get across with this talk is that every time somebody uses a term, which is a piece of ambiguous language, you can do what I, as a game designer, would do and try and think about it as though it were a problem space in disguise. And I'll touch on problem space and what I mean by that in a second. So you're building something that doesn't exist. You're trying to describe things that don't yet exist. You're trying to listen to people who you might not have direct contact with. And all of this is going on. And at the same time, you need to try and not be a vending machine. And I was debating for a while whether to put a picture of the grog vending machine from Monkey Island or whether to put one of the NPCs from Mass Effect. But basically what I mean by this is that you are not supposed to stand there as a receptacle that gives out information when prompted and then your job is done. I remember reading an article, this is when I was teaching, I read an article that was talking about how most people fundamentally misunderstand what it means to be a teacher. They think of teachers as merchants or vending machines, in my observation, where people assume that they walk into a classroom, they've paid an amount of money, and the teacher is going to dispense some information, and they're going to walk away happy. But dispensing information is really half of the equation. Communication, as the talk's title suggests, is a two-way street. So what this article was suggesting is that teachers should not be seen as merchants. We are not holders of an object or a commodity that is information and we're giving it to you. We're laborers. we have the job of taking some information that we possess and putting it into the mind of somebody else. And if you get in front of a classroom of 20 or 30 people and you say, this is a thing you must know, some of them are going to remember that. Some of them are not. And so what you really want to do is try and spend a little bit of time making sure that everyone has understood it. And you can do this in a number of ways. You can ask people to paraphrase it back to you. You can make it into a discussion. You could put a test. People love putting down tests for teaching. Or you can ask people to build something according to the principles you've just suggested. If you're trying to articulate to someone, this is how you teach someone a new mechanic, now show me you've understood by making a simple platformer that does this, that's a really good way of verifying it. But what you're verifying there is that your job as a teacher is done, because you're the teacher, they're the learner, and they're only learners once they've learned. And that's kind of the key distinction I want to draw here. So this was the last video game that I released. This is Objects in Space. It's actually 2 screenshots of objects in space. On the right-hand side is a first-person perspective view of you staring at a couple of panels on a wall in a space station. And if you click on that little panel in the middle there that I've sort of circled in red, it expands. The camera zooms in and shows you the view that you can see on the left there. And what this is a merchant terminal where you can buy and sell parts for your ship. So each one of those is a component that you can purchase. It automatically transfers to your engine room once you have, and then you can apply it to different parts of your ship so that you get it running smoothly, running just the way you want. And when we wanted to build this, we kind of realized that the amount of different values that we would need to assign to every single part was going to be huge. We had something like 12 visitable star systems, 36 different space stations, all of which needed prices that were different to one another, so that the player had the opportunity to master the game by learning where they can buy particularly cheap parts in some certain type of manufacturer or of a certain class of part. And we wanted people to have that learning experience. We could, if we wanted to, just hard code the prices to be exactly the same wherever you go. It's always going to be 86 credits for this reactor core at this particular space station. But then as soon as you've learned it, and there's no replayability. So we wanted the prices to fluctuate a little bit and have a bit of wiggle room between them. So what we needed to do was create an algorithm that was going to spit out prices for us and something that was going to give us a degree of variance. And I'm going to show you a slightly simplified version of that. So let's say, for argument's sake, I've got a space muffler and it costs $8. And I'm trying to get this algorithm going. What we did originally was say, okay, space muffler's base value is $8. Let's multiply that by how close it is to the place where this item was created narratively. So in the game world, each of the brands and each of the types of part were actually manufactured somewhere in the world, and you could go and find out using our wiki, where they were manufactured and get an idea of where they were going to be cheapest. So we thought that'd be a really good thing to try to make sure that we got some interesting values. And then we would add a retail markup as a constant because that made sense to us. So when we first tried this, test number 1, Planet A spat out a reasonably normal amount. It costs $20. There's your retail markup and plus whatever else. Planet B was 45, but then Planet C spat out something ridiculous like 700,000. Okay, our nebulous algorithm was somewhat broken. It was not supposed to spit out things that were so absolutely wildly unrealistic that they would be either not fun or unfathomable for the player. So where we ended up, like I've put test 17 here, but who knows how many times we iterated on this algorithm, is that we take the base value of an object, we multiply it by its proximity to the manufacturing plant where it was born, we multiply that by an additional modifier based on how wealthy the star system is. So if you're in a really, really rich star system, we add an extra multiplier for that, and if you're in a poor one, we get a different one. What is the dominant financial sector of this system? So what we're talking about there is this a leisure system? Is this or planet rather? Is this a mining outpost? Is it an industrial plant? Is it an agricultural world, a financial one, et cetera, et cetera? And then we multiply that by another modifier, which gives us that star system's location relative to the central systems. So if you're on the outer rim, nowhere near where the central hubs of commercial activity are, that should also be a factor. And then we added a markup. And what we ended up getting was some reasonably decent values at the end of that we could then add a slight variable to and go from there. This one kind of stuck with me. I don't know why. Like I've done a whole bunch of different stuff with game design, but for some reason, the process of trying to figure out an algorithm that was going to make our economy make sense is something that's just stuck with me a lot over the years. And I see a distinct parallel in the way that I communicate with people in my day-to-day life and this algorithm process. If the algorithm is a stand-in for like an abstract piece of terminology that's being used, something that could mean a bunch of different things, then what we need to do to make sure that this abstraction is working is to test it. So if we think of it like a problem space, then we're starting to align the way that a designer will approach things with the way that I would like people to think about communications. So for anyone that's not familiar, problem space is a general area in which we know there is some kind of problem. So we could just say there is a problem, but a problem makes it sound like it's binary, makes it sound like it's distinct. It makes it sound like we already know exactly what this problem is. But any designer worth their salt will tell you that as soon as you've identified what you think is a problem, the first thing you need to do is really examine the nature of that problem and make sure that the thing you think is the problem is actually the problem. And then and only then do you start exploring solutions. So when we talk about a problem, what we're talking about is a general area of a product or a game or whatever where we know there is something that's got room for improvement. This area, however, is likely to be poorly defined. It's likely to have fuzzy boundaries, and it's likely to be linked to a million different other things. This last point's pretty unique to video games, though. You put yourself in a game world, if you're finding that people are having an issue with dying a lot, how many things in your game cause people to die? Probably an awful lot. So you really need to be careful about trying to figure out what the problem is too quickly and making sure that when you're figuring out the problem, you've identified 5 different things it could be so that you've systematically been able to narrow it down to the one you think it's most likely to be. I'm describing something that's a little abstract right now, and I'm aware of that. So I'm going to give you a couple of visual aids that help describe what I'm trying to say. On the left here is my visualization of a poorly defined problem space. The boundaries of this problem space are blurry, and you'll see that all of the other the potential things that could be the problem here. Maybe the problem is that the thing is too slow. Maybe it's too powerful. Is it actually a mechanics problem? Is it not to do with the mechanics and it's actually a HUD issue? Is it caused by a different mechanic that's impacting this one? Are they semi-related? All of those things I've kind of drawn as somewhat overlapping the fuzzy boundary of the poorly defined problem space, whereas a well-defined problem space, like the one on the right-hand side, is something with clear boundaries where you are very, very certain what sits inside it and what sits outside it. And if you spent a bunch of time noodling on a problem, you'll start to know when someone says, hey, my character is taking too much damage, you'll be able to very quickly say, it is not because they're too fast, because we've explored this and we understand that it's not related to that thing. So being able to categorically say it's not that is very helpful when you're trying to communicate with somebody else what the problem is that you're working on and why. Now, as if this weren't enough words on screen, I'm going to put this up here. So on the right-hand side here, this is a word association cloud from Stanford University. It's taken the word light and it's put down every conceivable thing that somebody might mean when they're referring to the word light. And then it's put them in clusters. You can see in the top there, we've got industrial light, which has to do with sort of urban centers, electrical light, which is more to do with interiors and the like wattage and voltage of how light is seeping into a room. On the right-hand side, we've got visible light, where we're talking about the scientific definition, and we're talking about how light travels and how it's constituted of waves and that sort of thing. Down the bottom, we've got colors and weather and what it means when we're talking about light in that context. And then on the left, we've got the feeling. What does it feel like to feel light? And the reason that all of this is here is because light is a really good example of a word which everyone uses it every day. We all do. But it's something where it is actually quite ambiguous depending on the context. So if you were to put light into a poorly defined problem space, and this is kind of what I'm asking you to try and do, is to take the idea that someone said a word that could be interpreted multiple ways and go, oh, hold on, I've just got a small problem space. So if I were to put light into a problem space, I would have to go, okay, what exactly do they mean when they say this? We're very, very good at synthesizing information quickly. So what we can probably do based on context alone is go, they're not talking about electrical light or visible light or colors or weather or brightness. We already know from context that when they say light in this context, they mean X, Y, or Z. And we can narrow it down to maybe one of two things. And that's really good. However, even then, we might still have room for error. So we don't want to fool ourselves into thinking that just because we've eliminated a couple of things we know it's not, we're at the right conclusion. It's still imperfect. When we talk about communication, we've generally got a couple of different factors at play. One is the speaker's meaning, and the other is the audience meaning, and in between that is the statement from the speaker. So let's say I'm trying to convey to you a feeling of lightness. And I've got an association in my head between the feeling of lightness and the word light. But when I say that, I've got this association between those words, and I assume you do as well. But maybe for some reason you're reading it as industrial light. And there's all these other possible associations which are interfering. So this specific scenario is exactly the thing that I want to try and avoid. And I know that this sounds a little bit like I'm being really semantic and what are you talking about, Leigh? This is just talking to people. We do this all the time. It's not that hard. But what I see again and again is when someone says a word and someone doesn't interpret that word in the way the speaker intended, it can lead in a game dev environment to you making something the wrong way. It can lead to wasted dev hours. It can lead to all sorts of like small miscommunications that result in a problem not actually being solved. And especially when you're dealing with like fuzzy and difficult to pin down things like gameplay itself being a really abstract concept, this stuff becomes really important. So let's go back to light. Let's use it as an example. It is now our problem space. I work at Wargaming. We do a lot of stuff with vehicles, so I don't think it's a betrayal of confidence or a breach of NDA to say that I spend a lot of my time working on vehicles and handling and physics and how they feel. Paul, please disconnect my mic if I am wrong. So let's say that I get feedback saying I would like this vehicle to be light or lighter than it is. I've got so many things that could mean in my context straight away. I can already assume they're not talking about industrial light. I can assume they're not talking about the light spectrum and the scientific definition of it. So in my context, if someone gives me a vehicle and says, or that they play one of my vehicles and go, yeah, it's I don't know, I feel like it needs to be lighter. And this is someone who's important. This is an opinion that I need to respect, and I need to listen to this person. So what do I do? Well, what are some things light might mean? The first is that it could mean that it stops really, really quickly. Maybe that's what they mean. Maybe they mean the opposite. It accelerates really fast. Maybe it's about it turning quickly. Maybe it's about the thing feeling lithe or nimble. Or maybe they mean literally the weight of it is like the feeling that it is pressing against the ground is too much and they don't want it to be as heavy. Or maybe when they say light, they're talking about being airborne. When you're airborne, you get that feeling of weightlessness, and maybe this vehicle's not providing that for them and they feel like it should. But it's really tricky and a rather constant part of my job to be trying to interpret a whole lot of language from a whole lot of people, some of whom I won't even have met before, and turn that into actionable things that are going to improve the experience. So I have used all of my PowerPoint foo to circle the headline of this slide, because if you forget every single other thing about this talk, this is the slide I want you to pay attention to, because this is the sort of shorthand that I've trained myself into that I want other people to try and listen to as well. If someone uses a term like light, and I don't care if they're a client or a player or a stakeholder, it doesn't matter. If someone says they want something to be light, a really good practice to get into is to say, when you say light, do you mean X? So you know a few things that you might be thinking of when you think of light. So let's say for you, it's about it being not as like the feeling of weightlessness when you're airborne. If you say, when you say light, do you mean feeling weightless while airborne? You're immediately going to get a very good response. If what you say is not what they mean, they'll tell you. If it is what you mean, then great. But they'll also follow up telling you that that's not what they mean by re-articulating it and giving you another example. So when you say light, do you mean a feeling of weightlessness when you're airborne? Oh, no, no, no. I mean it stops really, really quickly. I want it to stop on a dime. That's the sort of thing. If you start with an example of your own, they're quite likely to come in with an example of their own and say, no, different example. But you're the one who's leading the way by going, this is abstract. Let's illustrate by looking at an example. Another similarly okay way to say this would be when you say light, what I hear is X. So when you say that that you want this vehicle to be light, what I hear is you want it to accelerate faster. And if you're wrong about that, again, they'll jump in and correct you. But the point is that you've made them think about what they mean by this ambiguous term with a specific concrete example that they can either refute or be on board with. You could also say, hold on, what do you mean by light? The problem there is that there are a lot of words in the English language, like 600 odd thousand, I think. And if someone has had all these words at their disposal and the best thing they could do to try and come to you and say, this is what I want, is to say, I want it to be lighter, then you basically saying, wait, what exactly do you mean? Is saying, say the same thing but in different words. And that's tricky. That's anxiety inducing. You don't want somebody to be on the other end of a phone call with you or a Zoom call or whatever and say, what, I just did that. I just tried. What you didn't understand me? That's frustrating. Whereas if you were to say, when you say light, do you mean X? You're saying, this is what I understood by your use of the term. And people are more likely to go, oh, so when I said this word, they took it that way. They've got something to build off and something they can use.
Sorry, folks. I think we've got a slight technical issue, but I believe Leigh is back.
Technical issues. It's the one thing I didn't check, Paul.
You've got fancy wireless headphones? Ooh.
Thank you. I forgot to get reimbursed for them.
Oh, you better do that.
So, where was I? So, yeah, telling people what you have understood and asking them if that's correct is a much better way than saying, what do you mean by that? Because it can make people flustered and frustrated, and you don't really want that, because then they'll want the conversation to end as soon as possible, and you want to get that information out of them. If you're trying to take direction from someone, and again, it could be a client who's giving you some work or a stakeholder or whatever, part of your job is to make sure you've understood what's in their head. It's like the reverse of the teaching example I gave earlier. Your job as a laborer in this instance is to extract information from somebody. If they're not giving you what you want, you need to tell them. The absolute worst thing you can do is, okay, cool, make it lighter. I understand, will do. And that latter scenario, this is the one that I keep on seeing. And honestly, with this talk, I kept on having, like, before presenting it at GCAP, like a crisis of confidence where I was going, no, this is a really simple talk. You're just saying, make sure you clarify with people what you mean. Like, that's easy. But it's so common that people don't do this that I feel like it's worth stating. If someone uses an ambiguous term, just be super on the lookout for it, and like think of it like a trigger. You've said something that is ambiguous. This is my cue to clarify, just so that you're aware when you've said X, I hear Y. And I think one of the reasons why I'm using light as an example here is that light is something that is very common. We all use this term every day. And if you say, when you say light, do you mean X? There's no chance that you're going to come across, like you're an idiot. It's fine. You're just trying to ask someone to clarify. I could have gone for like a much more jargon specific thing, like if someone uses a hyper specific game design term and you haven't heard it before, it can be really daunting to come in and say, oh, well, wait, what exactly do you mean by that? Because you don't want to be the person in the room that doesn't understand that game design term they're using. But, and I know people hear this a lot, we are a young industry. We do have a lot of jargon and terminology which is still in flux. And frankly, I've heard the exact same thing referred to in a million different ways by different people. Like problem space is something I use very frequently, but not all game designers do. And it's okay for you to just say to any game designer anywhere, when you're talking about this particular set of mechanics or this trope, what do you mean by it? No one's going to be confused as to why, because we're all still trying to figure out what all of this new terminology for our relatively new field means. So I'm starting with something uncontroversial like light, because I think that'll help. However, we are not done yet. So this is what we want, ideally. We've asked someone, when you say light, do you mean X, Y, or Z? And when they say, oh, no, that's not what I meant at all. This is what I meant. Like, let's say that they are talking about something which has to do with the handling of the vehicle. They're not talking so much about its acceleration. They're talking about like it, turning or stopping. Or maybe when I say handling, I mean something different to what you mean. The important thing is that you've understood each other at the end, not that one person is right about what terminology means. So if you ask this question, what you'll have as a result is a better defined problem space where you can go back and go, I know what I need to do. I need to make it lighter. And by lighter, I mean it needs to stop quickly or turn quickly or be lithe or nimble. And even lithe or nimble are words that could probably use a bit more definition on their own. But if you're able to clearly identify what is and isn't inside your problem space box, you're going to have a much better end product and you're going to solve the project more or the problem more effectively. And yeah, it is concrete in game design. We're about to tweak some specific variables. We need to know we're tweaking the right ones. And the only way to do that is to make sure we've fully understood the nature of the problem. This is Dr. Celia Hodent. For anyone who's unfamiliar, she's a consulting psychologist for various video games. And shortly before writing this talk, I was listening to her on the Bush League Gaming podcast, and they were talking about dark patterns of game design. And this was a tricky one because game design itself is fairly nebulous, and a dark pattern of video game design was an even trickier one to try and define. And so she was talking to the hosts, and she was trying to get them to understand what she meant by the things that she was saying. And the obvious one that comes up, because it always comes up, is loot boxes. And so Dr. Hoden's been doing this stuff for a long time. She's heard people go, oh, okay, so we need to ban loot boxes forever. And as any game designer will tell you, the ability to dole out a random or semi-random reward to players, or at least something that feels random to them, is a really, really powerful tool in our arsenal. And it absolutely can be exploited in a negative way, but it doesn't mean that every single loot box is always awful forever. So what she was trying to get across is that if you put a dark pattern into a video game, what you're trying to do is put a pattern in there that is going to extract something from the player without or with very little regard for whether or not it feels good to them. So you go through the process of realizing that you're engaging with the monetization of a free-to-play game for the first time, and you get out the other end of it and go, cool, I've just made my first purchase, and you feel like you were misled somehow, like the thing that you're buying is not the thing you were promised. There's a variety of different situations where people can exploit a player's weaknesses. Like we've all got these kind of like psychological shorthands where we're kind of going, oh, that looks good, I will click on that, yes please. And a designer can manipulate those things in order to try and extract money from you at the expense of you walking away feeling bad about the experience. And that's what she meant by dark pattern. But it's really easy to go, yeah, you get a loot box, you open it, and it's like, oh, I didn't get the thing that I wanted. That's a bad experience. And she was very quick to go, no, that's actually not quite what I mean. The reason I bring up Dr. Hoden as an example is that she was very quickly articulating what something was not. And I want to stress that asking someone to clarify what they do mean by something, or giving them an example of, do you mean this thing, is just as valuable whether they say yes or no, whether it's inside or outside your problem space. So to go back to our light example, so if you were to say, So when you say light, do you mean you want it to accelerate faster? And they say no. That is still really, really helpful. Being able to categorically say they're not talking about just the acceleration factor gives you a really good clue as to what it might be. And so when Dr. Hoden says this, she's clearly done it many times before. She's like, I'm talking about dark patterns in game design. But just to be clear, I'm not talking about this thing here because everyone makes an association. She's discovered that by interviewing and talking to and consulting with so many different people who make that association that she knows it's a strong association and that she needs to cut it off at the root if she's going to make sure that people have the correct association at the end of her trying to convey that meaning. And we do the same thing in games in other ways as well. So these delightful images here represent two user personas. On the left, let's say we've got our target market for our game. Whatever our game might be, this is our target market. This is Leigh Harkness. And Leigh enjoys playing about an hour or so per evening, likes being told a story, enjoys having some light puzzle solving, and plays on a PS5. And specifically does not like reflex-based challenges or care much about high scores. And on the right here, we've got the anti-target. And this is literally something that we will do is we won't just have this is our target market, this is our user persona. We'll have this is our anti-persona. We specifically don't want to appeal to this person. So this is Leigh Paris, who's saying they do obsess over figuring out different systems. They play while in transit. They share strategies for games online. They buy heaps of merch, etc. But what they don't care about is achievements, and they don't want something linear. And the reason you might do this kind of ties back to what I was saying about Majestic Knights, where if you accidentally, through the way that your game looks, in trailers, in screenshots, through the marketing, through the way that you describe it, if you accidentally send a signal to the Leigh Parises of the world that your game is for them, when it's actually for the Leigh Harknesses of the world, then what you're going to find is a whole bunch of users are going to play your game and go, what is this? This is not what I expected. I'm not having a good time. Thumbs down. And it's not because your game's bad. It's just because it's found the wrong audience. And this is what marketing is communication on a mass scale. You really want to make sure that you get that sort of thing right. So when you're talking to anyone about anything, it's perfectly valid to say, when you say this, do you mean this? And have someone say, no, that's not what I mean at all. And when you're talking on a large scale, when you say you want this target audience, do you mean this other one over here that's really, really similar but has a couple of fundamental differences? No, I don't mean them at all. They're definitely going to have a bad time with our game. We don't want them to join our player base because if they do, they'll tank our reviews and hate it and we'll get a bad reputation. Legitimately, I'm speaking from experience there of finding a game that is mistargeted and watching as the people who are expecting one thing get given another and finding that they have a bad time. And when they talk about a game finding its audience, what they mean is it finds an audience that loves it. So it's probably a good game for someone. As long as you've made a decent game, it's going to be good for someone. And it's just a matter of making sure that the people who are drawn to your game are the ones who are going to like it. It's a mistake I've personally made multiple times. So I want to talk for a quick second about how children learn words. So children, a lot of people assume that children learn words by hearing them a certain number of times. And this is a partial truth. It is not the whole truth. Let's say hypothetically, I am here in my apartment and it's locked down or whatever. Let's say I've got a kid who's just learning to speak and they hear me refer to my fridge as nice. For some reason, that's an adjective I've chosen to use to describe my fridge. But let's say I've only ever used the word nice in that context. How kids learn words is by hearing words used in different contexts so that they can kind of triangulate the meaning. They can look for what the common elements are between one use case of a word and another use case of a word and go, oh, I see what those two things have in common. Therefore, the word must mean something that is true in both of those instances. So if I were to refer to my fridge as nice, then they would just be left thinking, okay, nice is a quality that fridge possesses, and they'll be waiting to hear another instance, another use of that word that's in a different context that will allow them to figure out what nice might mean and maybe pin down what it means for that fridge. Otherwise, they're left thinking, nice, that is a thing that fridges are. And the reason I bring this up is kind of for the last point that I want to make, which is about playtest feedback. I get heaps and heaps of it, and trying to wade through it and figure out what to change and what not to change and what people might be thinking is really key. So if someone tells me that my game is hard to control, that could mean a large number of different things. In my environment, I often get reports that say this is what players are saying. This is what players are saying. They're saying this thing is hard to control. Well, what do they mean by that? That's not really a good enough piece of information. So if I go and take a look at the raw data, and for many people who are making games or any kind of product, this raw data might be the thing that they get directly. You might be on a show floor at an expo. Well, maybe not so much in the last couple of years, but you might be just hearing players talk directly. You might be looking at all of this stuff and hearing people going, I couldn't turn when I wanted to. That's interesting. I kept crashing into things. That's also interesting. I don't steer fast enough. You can see a relationship between those three things, and you can sort of extract those things out and go, right, it seems like it's hard for people to control. You could draw a link between it's hard to control and I keep dying, because a game that's or a hero or a character or a vehicle or whatever that is hard to control is a vehicle or character that players are probably going to die a lot when they're using, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's correct. So when you're looking at heaps and heaps of input, what you really need to be doing is looking for things that kind of point to the same problem or mean the same thing, and it's always going to be expressed in different ways. So much like a child who's learning to talk for the first time, what you need to be doing is looking for, in different contexts, different people saying the same thing and extracting a common problem from that, from heaps and heaps of data. So this sort of brings me to the end. So just in summary, what I've tried to do is identify an abstract concept. So look at ambiguity, any kind of ambiguous language, whether it's light or something more detailed than that, and think about it like a game designer would a problem space. Just have like a switch or a toggle in your mind that goes, hold on, there is more than one way to say that thing. There's more than one reason why you might say that thing. We need to clarify. We need to clarify. And it's going to save you a whole lot of time and effort and money and potential embarrassment if you're really good at getting it right the first time. So we've been over a couple of examples. I started with Heraclitus, trying to describe the world in flux and using his example of the river. You can't step into the same river twice. I've talked about Majestic Knights and incorrectly describing it as an RPG and the impact that that was having on players and how we corrected it. For objects in space, I've talked about the abstract nature of our algorithm and how it kept on spitting out specific examples for us that we were using to try and correct it. Light as a specific example, Dr. Celia Hoden and the idea of using a negative example and saying, when I say this, I do not mean this, is a really powerful tool. Children and how they learn new words, and finally, trying to look for commonalities and things that point to the same root cause in a playtest. And it's a whole bunch of examples that are essentially just here to illustrate the one main point. And I think that's because the whole talk is kind of about that, which is when you say X, do you mean Y? Anything ambiguous comes up. If you hear something where you're not 100% certain, and it takes a bit of humility, when you say X, do you mean Y? It's a really great way to get a conversation started, and it's going to hopefully lead to a lot less friction in your communication, whatever part of the game development process you're in. This brings me to the end of my talk. So I believe I will hand it back to Paul.
You will indeed. Okay, we do have a couple of questions. So let's get it started. Now, if anyone else has any questions that they want to ask, I do have a few that people asked during the talk, so I've got those ready to go. But if you've got anything else, slip them into the chat and I will pass them on to Leigh. Okay, first up from Sergey Makes a Game. How do you make sure that the person on the other end understood what you meant? Maybe they forgot or hesitated to ask, what do you mean by light?
Right. So if you're in the other person's shoes, that's a good one. So in a situation where I'm trying to describe what someone means, it's a little bit tricky because the fine line that you need to walk here is you don't want to accidentally insult somebody. So if I were to say to you, yeah, can you please make this vehicle more light? And then someone else just does the bad thing and goes, yeah, I'll make it more light, no problem. Then it's kind of difficult to walk that fine line of going, do you actually know what I mean? Like, do you actually? It sounds like you're insulting them, like you didn't understand what light means, and that's not quite what you're trying to get across. I would suggest that it's not an easy thing to get around, and if you're in that position and you've said, I would like the vehicle to be more light, I'm just going to keep using that one example. If you said, I like the vehicle to be more light, and someone says, okay, I can do that, it's not too improper to just say, and just so I understand, when you say you're going to make it more light, what specifically do you mean? Because if you phrase it like that, in a sort of, when you say this, what do you mean? Then it's kind of that same, we're just looking for clarity. I'm just trying to make sure that I've understood you. Because if someone said, yes, I can do that, then in theory, even if they haven't used the same word that you have, they're still conveying its meaning back to you. They're still reflecting it. So it's not a problem to say, okay, cool, so you can do that. And just so that I understand clearly, when you say you're going to do that, what exactly is it that you say you're going to do? I think that's a good way of doing it. It's not bad. Like if you're trying to get rid of, if you're coming from a good faith place of saying, I want there to be clarity, then it's generally a good thing to say, let's make sure we all understand each other. So no matter which way you slice it, it's probably not going to be too bad. But yeah, I would say that if you were to say to someone, do you understand what I mean? That's the worst way of articulating the same thing, because it can come across like it's a bit aggressive, like it's you trying to go, really, do you know what I'm talking about? Or are you just someone who's going to run away with this and do whatever you want to? Just encourage someone to articulate it back to you and seek them paraphrasing, and you'll be in a good space.
Words to live by. Now, this next question sort of came up a couple of times in the chat, different variations of it. On
Different contexts.
Yeah, exactly. So this question came from Gaute. In my experience, clarifying terms can sometimes not be very popular if there's time pressure. Any advice on how to deal with that? That laugh said a lot.
Okay. I am going to borrow one from Ali's book here. So what I would suggest is that in the long run, getting a piece of communication right the first time is going to be more time efficient. And if someone is of the opinion that you're wasting time by bringing something up, then a really useful tool is to say, it sounds like there is still more to understand before we're on the same page, so we need to readdress this later on. And this can have one of two effects. Number one, you go, yeah, we're not quite there yet. We don't fully understand each other. This requires further conversation. We're going to book another meeting, but people seem to be a little bit allergic to booking too many meetings. So the other way that people might interpret that is, if we don't get to a point of clarity right now, then it's going to cost us additional time. And so there's a degree of passive aggression, but it's also something that makes people understand that, like, if we don't understand each other now, we will eventually have to. And we can either do it now here in this meeting by taking the time required to get that done, or we can do it in the looming threat of another meeting. And what's implicit in you threatening that it needs another meeting is that you're elevating the importance of the clarity of communication. And the reason for that is that you don't want people to go away and make the wrong thing and then come back saying, yeah, sorry, we've made it. Is this what you wanted? No, that's not what I asked for at all. And either way, time is on the line. It's just that the time of the meeting that you're in currently is a little bit more front of mind because you're all going over it. So that would be my suggestion, is ask people whether or not or not ask people, let people know that if we don't quite get to a point in this meeting where we all understand each other, that's fine. I understand your time, poor. We can finish this another time. It's a nice way of making sure that they understand that it's important enough that you will take the time necessary.
The problem is not going away.
Yeah.
Okay, next up, Alex asked, marketing games to the wrong audience. Wouldn't a game naturally work towards an audience that enjoys the game?
Not if that game has a negative review rating on Steam because it found its initial audience. It found its first audience was not the right one. So in my case, what I've seen is that my initial marketing for one of my games was really good. The presentation of it seemed to indicate quite well what the game was going to be, and it was ticking along nicely and had a long tail. We then participated in a humble bundle that pushed the game out to tens of thousands of people very quickly, and it was a nice short-term payday for us. But the downside is we suddenly had tens of thousands of new users, and because they're buying a bundle, they weren't specifically interested in our game. They were buying a whole bunch of different games, and they stumbled upon ours, and it happened to be quite hardcore. The game was a sort of Hitman style game, which was brutally, punishingly difficult. It was probably the sort of thing that you'd want to play if you enjoyed Dark Souls more than anything else. And if you picture Dark Souls for a second and you understand just how much people really, really did not like the experience of that game, if it was not their sort of game, then you kind of understand what I mean. And that drove the ratings for that game from a healthy long tail where we had very positive reviews on Steam down into mixed, and I don't know if we ever got below mixed, but it was bad. A huge, huge influx of reviews that of people that didn't get the game because they weren't the audience. The reason why that prevented us from finding the audience, or re-finding, I should say, the audience that we were going for originally, is that when people stumbled upon our game and wanted to check it out, even if they were the target audience, they weren't seeing a small niche number of people who were like, yeah, this game is pretty good if you pick it up. They were seeing a broader audience that was going, largely, I don't get it. So I think in the case of like a really, really big game, it is possible for a game to be marketed so widely and so broadly. Like when I say really big, I'm talking about tens of millions of dollars of marketing budget. It's possible for a game to be so widely broadcast to the world that even if only 10% of people really love it, that 10% is already a critical mass and it'll build a following. But if you're talking about an indie game where the only storefront you really have is Steam, you don't have that massive marketing budget to get you there. If that thing fails to find its audience, it can be really difficult to pivot and find the other one. But I think it's really important to make sure that you're making a game that has a particular audience in mind, because the likelihood that an audience is just going to happen to find your game can be quite wrong if you haven't designed it for a particular audience. Where this most often manifests is in the visual style of the game and the affordances it promises you from the way that it appears versus what it actually is. So let's say you've got a game which looks really, really light and fluffy, and it looks like it's going to be a gentle, fun, casual time that you can pick up and play, but you've actually made it something which is really hardcore for whatever reason, going, yeah, it's okay, it'll find the audience. Often the experience someone has of looking for your game is to scroll through a store and just see a couple of images and go, yeah, not for me, or yeah, this looks like it's something that I'll enjoy. Word of mouth absolutely can sustain games, but it still requires enough people who already know and understand your game and are enthusiastic enough about it to want to spread the word, that if you don't have that, it can be a death sentence for the game. It's I think honestly that question is probably an entire talk in itself. I feel like I've just given like 4 answers to it, and I don't think I'm quite satisfied with any of them. But remind me about that one, because it's something that I feel deserves more time in the spotlight.
You heard it
Whoever
here
that
first,
is.
everyone. January's talk from Leigh will be on that very question.
Thank you, Paul.
We have a follow up question from Alex, which I think is probably the most controversial question we're ever going to have.
Wow.
And you opened the door because you mentioned them earlier. What are your thoughts on loot boxes?
What are my thoughts on them? I don't know. Is that controversial? I think everything is a matter of degree and intent. So by degree, I mean if you give someone a reward that is uncertain, then that's a thing that almost every single video game features in some degree. You walk around a corner, there's an enemy there, or there's not an enemy there. There's a degree of uncertainty. And revealing something to the player that they weren't sure what it was going to be is a fundamental part of something being a new experience. If you make that slightly more tangible by going, hey, congratulations, you've got a chest in front of you in an action combat game. You open the chest, and sometimes it's going to be coins, other times it's going to be magic, spell power, or whatever the case may be. It's fine. It's a similar sort of principle. Where that kind of gets exploitative is when you go, this is, part of a Skinner box. It is saying, we're going to give you this uncertain reward at an uncertain time, and the only thing that you're actually here for is that reward. The gameplay, whatever it might be, is secondary to you earning that reward. And when you tie that into free-to-play mechanics and start to get into that kind of territory of you basically just you exist for the purpose of acquiring a loot box, then it can be really, really dark. But it's very much a matter of degree, and there's a whole spectrum to it. And the other part is intent. When I say that, what I mean is that the person who put the loot box there, or I'm actually going to substitute loot box for just the word uncertainty. The person who put the uncertainty there did it for a reason. And when you use uncertainty on a player, you're generally doing it for any reason you can think of under the sun. It's because you want them to be excited, or you want them to be scared, or anything. Like you want them to be gratified, or you want them to be anticipating something and then have it be swept away from them. There are so many reasons why you might want to instill those emotional experiences in someone who's playing your game without it being a negative thing, that there's just no way for me to categorically say that anticipation or unexpected rewards are inherently bad. A loot box is a form or a degree of an unexpected reward, but the intention of the person who puts that unexpected reward there and what they're hoping you're going to experience is the much more pertinent point. I don't know. I really, really enjoyed buying a packet of Magic the Gathering cards when I was a kid, and no regrets. But I can see how, yeah, I can see how, depending on the circumstance, it's very dubious. So depends on the circumstance is my answer.
I'm showing my age and my being from the northern hemisphere-ness here, but it's like you say. When I was a kid, I used to buy packets of cards of this Marvel superhero characters, and they'd be randomized, and there'd be a piece of chewing gum in there, and the only thing you were guaranteed to get each time was the piece of chewing gum. You didn't know which characters you were going to get, but there was maybe 40, 50 to collect, and you'd end up with a bunch of doubles that you'd swap with your friends. We've got one more question, and then we'll head over to the Discord, which I've just put the link into the chat. Unless anyone has any other questions while Leigh is answering this one, stick it in the chat and I can ask. So, have you ever come across a situation, or what would you do if you and the person you're talking to can't find a common frame of reference? Maybe, different cultural backgrounds, maybe someone from Ireland and someone from Australia, and we've got completely different ways of referring to something.
In my experience, it just takes time. Like if I don't understand where someone's coming from and I seek clarification and they try and re-explain themselves and I still don't understand and I seek clarification again and they explain themselves again, eventually we get to a point where we understand each other. The big thing that can interfere, the thing that can stop it from happening, is whether or not you're approaching the discussion in good faith. So what I mean by good faith is if I am not attacking the other person, I don't mean to make them feel bad, and I've got no intentions other than just to understand what they're saying. If that's what's in my heart, they'll read that. And if it takes 3 or 4 or 5 times of people trying to explain themselves to each other and it's still not working, if you've got that positive, good faith attitude in your heart in the communication, then the communication can go on for as long as it takes to get you there. But if you're approaching it in this kind of, oh, this person is so frustrating, why don't they already understand what I'm saying? What I'm saying is perfectly clear, why don't they get it? If you're letting yourself get frustrated and you're approaching it with a, oh, this person is a moron type of attitude, it's going to cut the conversation short before you can get there. And yeah, in my experience, you probably will get to understand each other given enough time and patience, but the patience comes from that good-natured, good faith approach to the discussion.
Yeah. So having a certain degree of emotional intelligence probably doesn't hurt.
Yeah, and I think that's something people can generally work on and improve at.
Mm.
I find the term intelligence can sometimes make it sound like it's something innate that can't be improved or anything, like it's just with you for life, like it's in DNA, and it's not. It genuinely is something that people can try and work to get better at. So is patience in itself, for that matter.
Definitely. I'm okay. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so we're going to call it a day now. We'll head over to the Games with Wings Discord, hang out there for a while. If anyone does have any other questions, please feel free to ask them there. It is a voice channel, so just unmute yourself and ask your questions. I want to give another huge thank you to Leigh. He's been an absolute star this year. Every time I go to him, Leigh, any chance you could maybe do a talk next month? He's always put his hand up and gone, yep, I've got you. You're all good. So thank you, Leigh. I really, really appreciate it. And no doubt I'll have you back again next year. Hopefully talking about marketing your game to the wrong audience. We've got the talk right there. Thank you very much for that, Alex. So yep, we'll see you over in the chat in a couple of minutes. And yep, thank you very much again. We will see you next month with another talk.